Welcome to Sleep Stories by Oliver Penn. I am your host, and you have found your way here at exactly the right hour. This is a place built for the end of the day, for the moment when the world outside finally quiets, and something softer is permitted to take its place. Before we begin tonight, I would be glad to know where you are listening from. Leave a word in the comments if you like. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people in different corners of the world are settling into the same story at the same hour. If you find rest here, consider subscribing. New stories arrive regularly, and there will always be a lamp lit and a chair waiting. Now, set everything down. Whatever the day has left behind, let it wait until morning. It will keep. Make yourself comfortable. Close your eyes if you are ready, and take one slow breath. Tonight, I will take you somewhere unhurried, somewhere the light is always amber, the rooms are always warm, and the night outside is always still. All you need to do is listen. The train from London reached Harrogate at 2:30 on a Wednesday afternoon in August, and Louisa Vane sat in the trap for the better part of an hour after that, watching the Yorkshire countryside open itself in the particular way it had of opening. Gradually, without announcement, the fields and walls and slow upward rise of the moor, arriving not as a dramatic change of landscape, but as a gradual deepening of something she had always known was there and had been, for the past 12 years of London living, choosing not to think about too directly. She had not been to Stonegate Farm since the previous October. That visit had been brief, 4 days, her father already quieter than usual, the farm's rhythms proceeding around him with the self-sufficiency of a place that has been operating for long enough that it no longer requires the active direction of any single person. She had noticed in October that he was slower than he had been, that he sat for longer periods in the map room without emerging, that he took his meals at irregular hours and seemed, when she joined him for supper, to be returning from somewhere she had not been invited to follow. She had thought at the time that this was simply age, and had returned to London at the end of the 4 days, and had written regularly, and had received his brief, careful replies, and had not come back until now, when there was no longer anyone to come back to. Thomas Vane had died on the 14th of June in his sleep at the age of 67. The letter from Mr. Ackroyd, the farm's head man, 4 decades of the place in his hands and in his knowledge, had reached Louisa on a Monday morning, and she had read it at her desk between 2 manuscripts, and had sat for some time without doing anything, and had then done what was required, which was to make arrangements and inform the appropriate people and take the necessary leave from the publishing house and travel north. She had been delayed by practical matters, the legal necessities of the estate, correspondence with the solicitor in Harrogate, the settling of several immediate questions about the farm's continued operation through the harvest season. She had managed all of this from London, with the particular competence she brought to tasks that required organization rather than feeling, and had arrived now in August, the harvest already underway, the farm at its most active and most itself. The trap turned off the main road at Caldwell Cross and took the northern lane toward the moor, and Louisa watched the hedgerows change from the managed tidiness of the lower farmland to something wilder and more particular, the stone walls thicker and more irregular, the fields smaller, the vegetation along the lane edges showing the tough character of plants that grew at altitude, accustomed to wind and cold and the long Yorkshire winters. Stonegate Farm appeared at the end of a farm track of perhaps half a mile, the house low and long and grey against the backdrop of the moor above it, the August fields around it gold with the cutting grain, 2 or 3 figures visible in the nearest field, moving with the steady, purposeful rhythm of harvest work. The smell reached her before the house did, cut grain and warm stone, and beneath both, something she had no name for, but recognized immediately as the smell of the place itself, accumulated across 30 years of knowing it. She stepped down from the trap and stood in the yard and looked at the house and understood, in a way she had not fully understood while managing it from London, that her father was not in it. Mr. Ackroyd met her in the yard with the particular quality of someone who has been going about necessary work and has not stopped doing so simply because someone has arrived, which was entirely characteristic of him, and which Louisa found, standing in the August afternoon with her trunk being carried inside by the farm boy, more comforting than any more demonstrative welcome would have been. He was 71 years old, and showed it in the way of men who have spent their working lives outdoors, weathered and spare, and moving with the careful economy of someone who has learned not to waste effort. His face the particular dark brown of Yorkshire outdoor work, his eyes the particular grey of someone who has been assessing weather and livestock and the condition of stone walls for 4 decades, and has developed, through this practice, a general quality of accurate observation that extended well beyond its original agricultural purpose. "Your room is ready," he said. "Cook has supper at 7. The harvest is going well. We'll be finished with the north field by Friday if the weather holds." He did not say anything about her father, or about the months since June, or about the fact of her being here now rather than earlier. These were things that did not require saying, in Mr. Ackroyd's understanding of what required saying, and Louisa found this correct. She went inside and found the house in the particular state of a place that has continued to be inhabited and maintained after the departure of the person who gave it its primary character. Everything in its correct place, everything clean and orderly, but the rooms carrying a quality of rearranged emphasis, as though the objects in them had shifted very slightly toward their own purposes, now that the person whose purposes they had primarily served was no longer present to organize them. Her father's coat was still on the hook by the kitchen door. She noticed this and did not touch it, and went upstairs. Her room was the same room she had always occupied on visits, the small southwest bedroom, low ceiling, the window looking over the kitchen garden and beyond it to the track that led up onto the moor. Someone had put fresh flowers on the windowsill, which was either Mrs. Hartley the cook or one of the farm women, and which struck Louisa as exactly the right gesture, small and practical, and asking nothing of her in return. She unpacked with the efficiency of long practice and came back downstairs and stood in the main corridor and looked at the door at the far end, the door to the east wing, to the room she was not yet ready to enter. It was closed, as it always was. Her father had always kept it closed when he was not in it. This had simply been the room's custom, established across so many years of his practice that it had become indistinguishable from a rule. She went instead to the kitchen and asked Mrs. Hartley for tea, and sat at the kitchen table in the August afternoon with the sounds of the harvest coming through the open window, voices, the creak of a loaded cart, the distant rhythm of scythes, and drank the tea slowly and let the place settle around her, which was what she had always done on the first afternoon of any visit, and which still, despite everything, felt like the right thing to do. The closed door at the far end of the corridor was still there when she went to bed that night. She had not opened it, she was not yet ready, but she was here, which was the necessary first thing. She woke to the sounds of harvest, not the quiet morning she might have expected. The farm in August was not a quiet place, and the day's work began early, the light arriving at 4:30 and bringing with it the sounds of the yard below her window, horses being prepared, the low voices of men beginning their morning with the particular subdued purposefulness of people who have a great deal to do, and have calculated exactly how to proceed through it. She lay still and listened. She had forgotten this. The August rhythm of the farm, so different from its winter or spring rhythms, the concentrated industry of it, the sense of everything being brought to bear on the specific urgent task of the harvest before the weather could change its mind. She had grown up with this sound, had spent every August of her first 18 years waking to it, and had then spent 12 Augusts in London waking to city sounds, and found now that the farm's August sounds arrived not as something strange, but as something she had simply been not hearing for a long time and was hearing again. She dressed and went downstairs and found Mr. Ackroyd already in the yard, directing the morning's work with the quiet authority of someone whose directions have been trusted for long enough that they no longer require particular force to be followed. He looked at her with his assessing expression and said, "The north field will be cut by midday if you want to see it," and she said she would come out later in the morning, and he nodded and went back to his work. She had breakfast alone in the kitchen. Mrs. Hartley had been and gone, leaving bread and cold meat and a pot of tea on the table, with the practical consideration of someone who understands that visitors on the first morning need to be fed without requiring company, and sat afterward for some time with the empty cup in her hands, looking at the kitchen window and the yard beyond it, and the edge of the north field, visible past the yard gate, already alive with the motion of the harvest. Then she stood and carried her cup to the sink and walked along the corridor to the east wing. The door opened quietly, the latch lifting smoothly. It had never stuck. Her father had always kept the mechanisms of the house in good order. She stood in the doorway for a moment without entering, letting her eyes adjust to the room's particular quality of light, which was different from the rest of the house because the single window faced east, and the morning sun came through it at an angle that caught the dust in the air and made it visible as a slow gold movement throughout the room. The room was as he had left it. She had expected this, and the expectation did not make it easier, because the thing about a room left as someone has left it is that the leaving is made very specific and very present by the exactness of the arrangement, the pen beside the ink bottle, the parallel rulers at the edge of the drawing board, the half-finished chart on the board's surface, the stool pushed back slightly as though he had stood from it quickly and intended to return. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her and stood very still in the morning light and the dust and the smell of the room, paper and ink and linseed oil, and beneath all of these, something she could not name but recognized as simply the smell of him, accumulated across 40 years of working in this space, and let the room be what it was, which was where her father had lived most fully, and where she had, almost always, not followed him. She began to understand the room by walking it slowly, not examining anything yet, simply walking the perimeter, the way she might walk a room she was cataloguing for the publishing house, noting what was present before beginning to assess it. This was a habit of her professional life that had proved, across several years of working with manuscripts and reference materials, to be the correct approach to any room full of organized information. Understand the organization before engaging with the content. The walls were the first thing. Every available surface was covered, not haphazardly, not in the accumulated disorder of a room where things had been added without system, but in the deliberate arrangement of someone who had thought carefully about what should be where and why. The largest maps hung on the two long walls, the great survey sheets she recognized from childhood as her father's primary work, the Dales in sections, each one representing months of walking and measuring and recording. Smaller maps occupied the spaces between, and between those, individual drawings of specific features, a river course, a valley cross-section, the detailed rendering of a particular section of moorland that he had apparently found worthy of more attention than a survey map could give it. The desk occupied the center of the room. She had seen it on previous visits, always with her father at it, or away from it, but clearly belonging to it. The desk inseparable from the man in a way that made approaching it now feel different from approaching any other object in the room. She approached it anyway, because she had come here to do this, and stood before the drawing board and looked at the half-finished map. It was the largest thing she had seen him working on, a single sheet of the heavy paper he preferred, perhaps 3 feet by 2, mounted on the board, and showing the northern section of the Dales above Caldwell Cross, the moor country, the high ground, the complicated topography of the watershed above Coldmoor, that she knew from years of looking at his work, was one of the most difficult sections of the Dales to render accurately because of the way the land folded in on itself. The left section of the map was finished. The rendering was precise and confident, the contour lines closely spaced and consistently weighted, the drainage patterns indicated with the particular shorthand she recognized from his other maps, the footpaths and tracks marked in their correct positions. This was the work of his full competence, the product of 40 years of practice. She could see this even without the technical knowledge to evaluate it formally. The right section was blank, not blank in the way of a sheet not yet begun. She could see the faint pencil guidelines where he had begun the preliminary mapping, the framework onto which the finished work would have been built. He had started and had not finished, which was simply what had happened, the work interrupted not by a decision to stop, but by the ordinary and irrevocable interruption of death. In the finished left section of the map, in the area where the moor rose toward its highest northern point, there was a small mark in red ink, not a standard cartographic symbol, not the hatching that indicated rough ground, not the spot height notation, not any of the standard marks she had learned to recognize across years of working with his maps. Simply a small X, precisely placed, the ink a different red from anything else on the sheet. Beside the X, in his handwriting, very small, Pennington. She looked at this for a long time, standing at the desk in the east-facing morning light, the August sounds of the harvest coming faintly through the single window, the room around her smelling of paper and ink, and the particular presence of her father's absence. She did not know what Pennington was. She spent the rest of the first morning with the maps on the walls. She had looked at them before, across childhood visits and the occasional adult return, but always in the way one looks at the furniture of a room one knows well, noting presence rather than content, aware without attending. She attended now, moving along the walls with the slow, careful consideration she had brought to the desk, reading the maps in the way her years at the publishing house had taught her to read any document, not looking for a single thing, but allowing the whole to make its impression before narrowing toward the particular. The maps covered, collectively, the better part of 40 years of work. She could trace the chronology. He had dated each one in the lower right corner in the same precise notation he had used for everything, and the earliest dated maps on the wall were from 1836, when he would have been 28 years old, and the most recent from the spring of this year, which was the last full map he had completed before the unfinished sheet on the desk. The early maps were good, but not yet fully his. She could see, even without detailed cartographic knowledge, the places where the technique was still finding itself, where the rendering of contour was slightly less assured than in the later work, where the decisions about what to include and what to omit had not yet become instinctive. By the 1850s, the maps had acquired the quality she associated with his mature work. the particular clarity of someone who has resolved all the fundamental questions of method and can now attend entirely to the specific challenge of the terrain before him. She was looking for the X. She found it for the first time on a map dated 1849, a survey of the upper moor country above Coldmoor, the northern section she recognized from the unfinished sheet on the desk. In the top right of the map, in precisely the position the unfinished sheet suggested, a small X in red ink. No notation beside it on this earlier map, simply the mark, placed with the same precision as everything else on the sheet. She found it again on a map from 1857, and again on one from 1863, and again, as she worked her way along the walls, not on every map, only on those that covered the northern section, only on those where the position was geographically relevant, but consistently present whenever the terrain permitted it. The same small X in the same red ink at the same precise location across more than 2 decades of work. She counted 12 maps on which the mark appeared, 12 maps across 26 years, from 1849 to 1875, each one placing the same symbol at the same point on the moor above Coldmoor. She went back to the desk and looked at the unfinished map and at the X there with its single-word notation, Pennington. And then she looked at the earliest map with the mark 1849 and understood that the notation was absent from all the earlier ones, not because the name was unknown to him, but because he had not needed to write it down. It was only on the last map, the unfinished one, that the name had appeared beside the mark, as though at the end he had wanted to be explicit about something he had always before kept implicit. The writing of the name, a different kind of acknowledgement from the simple placing of the mark across all the preceding years. She stood at the desk in the August morning and looked at 12 maps and understood that whatever Pennington was, her father had been thinking about it for at least 26 years. She found Mr. Ackroyd at the edge of the north field in the early afternoon, watching the cutting progress with the expression of someone calculating something, yield, pace, weather probability, without appearing to be doing anything in particular. She stood beside him for a moment, watching the same thing, which was the field being reduced from standing grain to cut rows by the steady rhythmic work of 4 men moving in the particular coordinated way of people who have done this work together before and have developed, through repetition, a wordless efficiency that required no direction. Pennington, she said. He did not react immediately. He continued watching the field for a moment, and then he said, "Where did you see that?" "On the map," she said, "the unfinished one, and on 12 others going back to 49. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, which was within the range of his established behavior. Mr. Ackroyd did not fill silences simply because they were present, had never done so in 40 years of her knowing him, and she had learned across those years that his silences were generally the silences of someone thinking rather than someone declining. "Pennington is a place," he said finally, "up on the north moor, above Coldmoor, Thornstone farmhouse, abandoned 30 years ago or more. The family that farmed it, the Penningtons, they went to Canada in the 50s. What was left of them? What was left of them," she said. He looked at the field. "There were 3 of them at the end," he said, "the father and the mother and the daughter. The sons had gone before, one to the sea, one to Leeds. The daughter went with the parents." He stopped. She waited. "Your father knew them," he said, "when he was young, before you were born. He used to walk up to Pennington. This was before I came to Stonegate, but I heard of it after. People in the village knew. He walked up there most weeks, one season or another. He was doing his survey work, mapping the North Moor, and Pennington was on his route, he said. The pause after he said carried more information than the words before it. What was the daughter's name? Louisa asked. Eleanor, Mr. Ackroyd said. Eleanor Pennington. She would have been, he calculated, 20 or so when they left. Your father would have been about 30. She looked at the field. The afternoon harvest was proceeding with its steady mechanical rhythm, indifferent to whatever she was understanding. Did he ever talk about her? She asked. Once, Mr. Ackroyd said, years ago. He had had rather more to drink than was usual for him, which was the only time he talked about things he otherwise didn't. He said that some things happened at the wrong time, and there was nothing to be done about that. He said he had been mapping the wrong things for years and had known it and kept mapping them anyway because it was what he had to do. She thought about this, the wrong things, mapped faithfully across 40 years, the right thing marked with a small X on every relevant survey. Did he ever go back, she asked, to Pennington after they left? Mr. Ackroyd was quiet for a moment. Not that I know of, he said. He looked at her steadily, but I think he meant to. She went back to the map room after supper and stayed until the August evening had gone entirely dark outside the east window, which took longer than she expected because August evenings in Yorkshire took their time about darkness, the sky holding light in its northern portions long after the sun had properly set. She was not looking for anything specific. She had what Mr. Ackroyd had given her, the name, the story's outline, the particular quality of his pause after he said she said. She was sitting with the maps rather than examining them, the way you sit with something you are still absorbing rather than something you have finished understanding. The room was quiet. The harvest sounds had diminished with the evening, the work continuing but the workforce reduced to the final tasks of the day, the voices fewer and more distant. Through the window she could see the last gold of the August sky above the moor, the heather just beginning its turn toward purple. She could see it from here, the faint suggestion of colour on the high ground, the moor announcing its own late summer in the way it always did, unhurried, on its own schedule. She looked at the maps as though they were a text she was reading for the second time, after having learned something about the author that she had not known on the first reading. This was a thing that happened with books at the publishing house. You would read a manuscript once and form an impression, and then learn something about the writer's circumstances or history, and read it again and find it saying things it had not said the first time, the content unchanged, but your apparatus for receiving it different. The maps said different things now. She could see, moving along the walls with this new understanding, places where his attention had been drawn, where the rendering was more detailed than the terrain strictly required, where he had returned to a section that was already adequately mapped and improved it, added to it, given it more care than a professional survey would have demanded. These places were, she could see now that she was looking for them, consistently in the northern section of the Dales, consistently in the general territory above Coldmoor, consistently in the direction of the unmarked X. He had been mapping towards something she understood, not away from it. All those years of survey work, moving outward from Stonegate Farm across the Dales, had also been a sustained movement in the direction of the North Moor, a professional preoccupation that had never quite reached its personal destination. She found, on a map from 1861, something she had missed on her first pass along the walls, a very small annotation in the margin, almost too small to read without bringing the lamp close. She brought the lamp close. The ground between here and Pennington has never been properly surveyed. I know it better than the map shows. This is a deficiency I intend to correct. She read this twice, An annotation in a margin, written in 1861, 14 years before the unfinished map on the desk. A deficiency he intended to correct. The correction had never come, or rather it had come partially in the form of the unfinished map, which had begun to render the ground between here and Pennington, and had not finished because he had died in June before the August survey season could begin. He had meant to do it. He had been intending to do it for 14 years before he died, and possibly longer, and he had finally begun in what proved to be the last months of his life, and he had not finished. She sat at the desk with the lamp and the unfinished map and the August night around her, and thought about intentions that are held for decades and still, in the end, run out of time. The following days had the rhythm of the harvest, which was a rhythm Louisa had forgotten she knew. The early start, the long middle, the slow wind down of the evening, the whole day organized around the specific mechanical requirements of cutting and gathering and carting and stacking before the weather could change. She was not part of the work exactly. It was not her work. She did not have the skills for it, and inserting herself would have been more distraction than help. But she found herself moving through it, present at its edges, in the way of someone who lives in a house where a significant thing is happening and cannot entirely avoid the significance, even if they are not its primary participant. She brought water to the field in the late mornings. This was something she had done as a child. She had a clear memory of it, the heavy bucket, the walk from the yard pump to the north field, the particular thirst of harvest workers, the brief pauses in the work when the water arrived. Mr. Ackroyd accepted this without comment, which she took to mean it was acceptable, and the men accepted it with the nods of people who are grateful for water and have nothing to add to the gratitude. She spent the mornings in the map room. She had begun, across these harvest days, to learn the room in a more systematic way than she had managed on the first 2 days of simply looking and absorbing. She was going through the desk drawers and the narrow bookcase methodically, not searching for anything specific but cataloguing what was there, understanding the organization her father had imposed on his materials and what that organization revealed about how he had worked. The drawers held the working materials of a cartographer's practice, papers in various sizes and weights, spare instruments, a collection of pencils in different hardnesses organized by degree, notebooks containing field observations, small printed reference maps that he had used as starting points and then superseded with his own more detailed surveys, all of it organized with the same precision as the finished maps on the walls, the organization so thorough and so consistent that she could see immediately if something was out of place. Nothing was out of place. Everything was exactly where it should be, which was, she had come to understand, the way her father had always kept things, not as an expression of temperament so much as a professional requirement, the working cartographer's understanding that if you cannot find your tools, you cannot do your work, and if you cannot do your work, you cannot make accurate maps, and inaccurate maps were worse than no maps because they misled people who were trying to navigate real ground. She found, in the bottom drawer, a small collection of letters bound with a thin leather cord. Not many, perhaps 15 in total. She did not open the cord. She looked at the bundle for a moment and then replaced it in the drawer in the same position she had found it. Private correspondence was not, in her understanding of what she was doing here, part of what she needed to read. The maps told her what she needed to know. They told her with the precision of her father's own professional language, more precisely in some ways than letters could have, because the maps recorded what he had actually done, rather than what he had felt about what he had done, and what he had actually done was to mark a specific place on the moor, with a red X for 26 years without once going there. This told her something more definite than any letter could have told her. She had been at Stonegate Farm for 5 days before she properly understood what she was feeling about the map room and its contents, which was not grief exactly, or not only grief, which had been present since June and was not going to resolve itself on any particular schedule, but something more specific, the particular feeling of understanding a person differently after they are gone than you understood them while they were living. She had known her father as a kind man and a quiet one, as someone who had loved her in the particular way of a parent who does not find the expression of love easy, but finds the performance of it, the provision, the attention, the faithful presence entirely natural. She had known him as someone who worked constantly and who found in his work a satisfaction she had recognized from childhood as real and complete, the satisfaction of someone whose work and self were not in conflict with each other. She had not known him as someone who had loved a woman before her mother, or as someone who had held a private grief for 26 years without ever quite resolving it, or as someone whose professional life had been shaped, at least in part, by the direction of something he had never done. She had not known this, and she understood, sitting in the map room on the 5th evening, with the lamp and the maps and the August darkness outside, that she could not have known it, not because he had actively concealed it, though the concealment had been effective, but because she had not, in 24 years of visits and letters and brief shared suppers, asked the right questions. This was not, she told herself, a thing to blame herself for. Children did not generally ask their parents about the people they had loved before the children arrived. The sequence of life that produced a child rendered that child unable, by nature, to be curious about the period that preceded its own existence with the full curiosity it might otherwise bring to the question. She had simply been the daughter of a man rather than the biographer of him, and daughters were not required to know everything, and the knowledge she was acquiring now was the knowledge that came to people after the fact, available only after the person was no longer present to provide it in controlled doses. She was acquiring it nonetheless. Mr. Ackroyd came to the map room on the 5th evening, knocked first, which was characteristic. He had always knocked even on rooms he had entered freely for 40 years, some habits of consideration being too deeply established to vary, and stood in the doorway and looked at the room with the expression of someone who has been in this room many times and finds it both familiar and different in the current circumstances. He said, "I should tell you something." She looked at him. He said, "Your father went to Pennington once. This was 2 years ago, maybe 3. I didn't know he'd gone until afterward. He went alone, on a morning when the weather was fine, and came back in the afternoon and didn't say where he'd been, but Mrs. Hartley saw him come back and said she said he looked like he'd been somewhere important." Louisa was quiet. "He didn't say anything to me about it," Mr. Ackroyd said. "Not then, not after. But I knew where he'd gone, because the day before he went, he'd been in here longer than usual, and I could see through the window that he had the Northmoor maps out." She looked at the Northmoor maps on the wall. "He went there once," she said. "Once that I know of," Mr. Ackroyd said. He paused. "He came back quieter than usual, but not unhappily quiet, I thought. More like someone who had finished something." She walked to Pennington on the 6th morning. She had not planned to go so soon, had told herself she would wait until she had spent more time with the maps, until she understood better what she was looking for, but woke in the early August morning to the sounds of the harvest and found, lying in the half-dark, with the farm's day beginning around her, that she was not going to wait any longer. She told Mr. Ackroyd at breakfast that she was going to walk to the North Moor. He looked at her with the assessing expression and said, "Take the wool track past the top field, then follow the wool north until you reach the stone cairn, then bear left. You can't miss the ruin from there. It's perhaps a mile beyond the cairn." She repeated these directions to herself as she walked out through the yard gate and across the top field. The harvest here already done, the stubble pale gold in the early morning, and onto the wall track that led upward toward the moor. The August morning was clear and cool at this altitude, the overnight chill still present in the air despite the day's promise of warmth, and she walked with the particular quality of attention she had been developing across the days in the map room. Not the distracted walking of someone going somewhere, but the attending walking of someone who wants to receive what the landscape is telling them about itself. The moor opened as she climbed above the farm's highest walls. This was one of the things she had forgotten about Yorkshire moors, the way they arrived after the enclosed farmland with the quality of something released, the landscape suddenly opening its full extent in every direction, the walls and hedges gone, and the ground rolling away in long slow curves toward horizons that were further than they appeared. The heather was just beginning its turn, the first purple coming through the dominant brown-green of August, and the light on it was the particular low-angled morning light of August that made everything it touched seem more precisely itself than it would at midday. She found the cairn and bore left, as Mr. Ackroyd had said, and walked perhaps another mile across the rough ground, the path here barely a path, more the suggestion of one, a slight depression in the heather where feet had passed over the years, not many feet, not recently, but enough to leave a trace. She followed the trace. The ruin appeared on a slight rise ahead of her, and she stopped for a moment when she saw it. It was not dramatic, a collapsed section of wall, a standing corner, the suggestion of a doorway in what remained upright, the roof long gone, the interior open to the sky, the stone already reclaimed by the moor's vegetation at the base, heather and bilberry growing close to the walls, the ground inside the ruin itself, a rough mixture of grasses and small plants that had established themselves in the 30 years since the house was abandoned. But it was a house. The proportions of it were still visible in the standing corners and the suggestion of the walls, the particular scale of a building made for people to live in, and standing before it she understood, with the unexpected force of the physically present, that this was where Eleanor Pennington had lived, where she had woken and gone to sleep and done the daily things of her life until the day she had stopped doing them here and gone somewhere else entirely. She stood at the entrance, the gap in the wall where the door had been, for a long time, without going in. She went inside eventually. The interior of the ruin was not what she had expected, which was something bleaker, something more thoroughly erased. Instead, it had the particular quality of a place that has been returned to its landscape rather than simply abandoned. The walls still defined the space, and the space still had the proportions of rooms, and within those proportions, the moor's vegetation had done what it always did, which was to proceed according to its own requirements, without particular reference to what had been there before. She stood in what had been, she thought, the main room, the largest space, the one that would have centered the house's daily life. The floor was uneven now, the original stone flags buried under decades of accumulated organic matter, but the walls were sufficient to give the room its shape, and the shape was still, recognizably domestic. She could imagine a fire against the far wall. She could imagine a table. She could imagine the morning light coming through the gap that was now the window, falling across the floor in the same direction it fell now, because the walls still directed the light despite having lost the glass that had once modified it. She sat on a fallen section of wall and looked at the space around her and thought about Eleanor Pennington, who had been perhaps 20 years old when she left this place, who had gone to Canada with her parents in the early 1850s and had not, as far as Louisa could determine, come back. She thought about her father at 30, walking up to this place in the weeks before the Penningtons left, what those walks had been, what had been said or not said, what had been understood by both parties about what was happening and what could not be prevented. She thought about 12 maps with a small red X. She thought about a walk taken 2 years ago, alone, the morning weather fine, and a return in the afternoon with the quality of someone who had finished something. She understood, sitting in the ruined house in the August morning, that her father had come here and had stood in approximately the place she was now sitting, and had looked at the same ruined walls she was looking at, and had, what? She could not know exactly, but she thought, from what Mr. Ackroyd had said about how he came back, not unhappily quiet, more like someone who had finished something, that he had perhaps simply stood here, as she was standing, and looked, and allowed the place to be what it was, which was a place where something had happened that could not be changed, and from which, nonetheless, something worth returning to had remained. The morning was very still on the moor, no wind, which was unusual. The moor was nearly always moving, the air coming off the high ground, with the particular character of high-altitude air that seemed never entirely settled. But today it was still, and the sounds that reached her were the sounds of the moor itself, a curlew somewhere, distant and particular, and beneath that the near silence of a landscape in its August fullness, everything that was going to grow this year having grown, everything that was going to flower having flowered, the whole year at its maximum extent, and beginning, very slowly and without announcement, its turn toward autumn. She stayed for perhaps an hour, then she stood and looked once more at the standing walls and the open sky above them, and walked back down to Stonegate Farm. She did not go to the map room that evening. She sat instead in the main room of the farmhouse, the room where her father had spent his evenings when he was not working, the room she had always associated with him in his non-working mode, which was the mode she had most often seen and read from a book she had brought from London, and found, reading it, that the words were not reaching her. She turned the pages nonetheless, because the habit of reading was settled enough to sustain itself even when its product was not fully available to her, and found that the evening passed in this way, the lamp burning, the harvest sounds outside, now the quiet sounds of the end of the harvest day rather than its middle. Mr. Ackroyd came in at 9 to say the north field was entirely cut and stacked, and that the weather looked well for tomorrow, and she said that was good, and he said good night, and she said good night, and he went. She thought about Pennington. She thought about what it meant to go to a place knowing you were too late for the thing the place had been, and to go anyway, and to find in the going, not what had been there, which was irretrievably gone, but what remained, which was different. The walls remained, the proportions of the rooms remained, the light fell through the window gap in the direction it had always fallen. These were not the things that had mattered when the house was inhabited. They were not Eleanor Pennington, or the life she had lived there, or the circumstances that had taken her elsewhere, but they were the things that remained, and remaining was not nothing. Her father had understood this, she thought. He had waited a very long time to go. Perhaps he had waited until he understood what going would give him, which was not what he would have wanted at 30, but which was, at 65, perhaps sufficient. The place as a place, with its walls and its light and its more. The fact of having stood where she had stood, the particular quality of not unhappily quiet that Mr. Ackroyd had described. She put the book down and sat with the lamp and thought about the unfinished map on the drawing board in the map room, the finished left section and the blank right section, the X at the boundary of the two, the name written beside it in his handwriting, Pennington, and below, in the smaller, more careful hand of something added later, I meant to go. He had gone, once, 2 years ago, returning quiet in the afternoon. He had gone, and it had been what it had been, and he had come back, and had not gone again, and then he had begun the last map, the one that would have rendered the ground between here and there more accurately than any of the previous maps, and he had not finished it. She understood, sitting in the lamplight in her father's house, that she was going to finish it. Not tonight. She was not ready tonight, and the readiness mattered. She had a sense that approaching the drawing board too soon, before she had fully received what the room and the maps and the walk to Pennington had given her, would produce something rushed and insufficient. But soon, in the remaining days of the August visit, she was going to sit at her father's desk and take up his instruments and complete, to the best of her ability, what he had left unfinished. This was not because she had his technical skill, which she did not. It was because the map needed to be finished, and she was the person who was here, and these two facts were sufficient. She began learning the instruments on the 7th morning. She had not, in 12 years of working at the publishing house with maps and geographical texts, learned to make them. Her knowledge was the knowledge of someone who understood what maps represented and how to evaluate their quality, not the knowledge of someone who could produce one. But she had, across those years, absorbed a considerable amount of cartographic method, and she understood the instruments in the theoretical sense, even if she had never used them practically. The drawing instruments were kept in a fitted case on the left side of the desk. She had found this on her first systematic examination of the room and had noted its contents without yet engaging with them. She opened the case now and went through it with the attention she had been bringing to everything in this room, learning the layout, the purpose of each instrument, the order in which they had been organized by the person who had used them daily for 4 decades. The parallel rulers she understood immediately. She had seen them used, had seen her father use them on the handful of occasions in her childhood when she had been briefly in this room, and their function was apparent from their construction. The proportional dividers she had to work out from the reference texts in the narrow bookcase. One of the geography texts included a section on drawing instruments and their use, and she read this section twice, standing at the bookcase, before returning to the desk. She practiced with the instruments on spare paper for most of the morning, making no attempt yet to work on the map itself. She understood that practice was required before she approached the actual sheet, that putting inadequate marks on her father's work would be worse than leaving it as it was, the blank right section, an honest record of incompletion rather than a compromised attempt at completion. Mr. Ackroyd found her at the desk at midday when he came to report on the morning's harvest progress, and stood in the doorway looking at her with his assessing expression for a moment before saying what he had come to say about the harvest. She reported that she was practicing before attempting the map, and he nodded as though this was the reasonable approach it was, and went back to his work. She ate lunch in the kitchen and returned to the practice sheets in the afternoon, finding as the hours passed that the instruments were becoming less unfamiliar in her hands. Not skilled, she was not going to become a cartographer in an afternoon, but manageable, the function of each one becoming something she could accomplish with reasonable consistency rather than something she was fighting against. At 4 o'clock she put the practice sheets aside and spread her father's map on the desk before her and sat with it for a while without touching it, simply looking at the finished section and the blank section and the boundary between them and the X at the northern point with its notation. She looked at the pencil guidelines visible in the blank section, the preliminary framework he had laid down before his death, the grid of faint lines onto which the finished work was to have been built. This was the structure. The structure was already there, already his, already correct, because he had done his field surveys and had known what the map needed to show and had prepared the ground for it. What was needed was the execution. She picked up the lighter of the 2 ruling pens and looked at it for a moment, and then she dipped it carefully in the ink and began. She worked on the map across the following days with a discipline she had not expected to find in herself for this specific task. It was slow work, slower than she had anticipated, even allowing for her inexperience with the instruments. Each line required consideration: the weight of the stroke, the angle of the ruler, the amount of ink on the pen, which she underloaded consistently at first and had to adjust, finding that the ink spread differently on the heavy mapping paper than on the practice sheets, requiring slightly more to produce the consistent weighted line she was aiming for. She aimed, in everything she did, to match her father's line. Not to replicate it exactly. She understood that exact replication was beyond her, that his line was the product of 40 years of practice and hers was the product of 2 days, and that the difference would be visible to any trained eye. But she aimed for fidelity to his intent rather than his execution. The same information rendered with the same kind of care, even if not with the same authority. She found the reference materials she needed in the bookcase, his field notebooks for the northern section, which he had completed and from which the map was to have been drawn. The observations precise and complete, every point he had measured and recorded already there in the notebooks, waiting to be transferred to the sheet. This was what she had that he had not had when he had started the map, the finished notebooks. He had done the field work, she needed only to render it. This distinction mattered to her. She was not inventing, she was transcribing, moving information from his notebooks onto his map, in his style as closely as she could manage it, completing an act of recording that he had begun and not finished. She worked in the mornings primarily, when the light from the east window was at its most useful, and occasionally in the evenings by lamplight when the day's accumulated progress had been good enough to make stopping difficult. The harvest continued around her, the farm's large purpose proceeding on its own schedule outside the map room's quiet, and she moved between the two, the harvest sounds and the measured silence of the room, in a rhythm that felt, after a few days, entirely natural. Mr. Ackroyd came each morning to report and to look briefly at the map's progress with an expression she had come to understand as approval or something very close to it, though he had not said so directly. On the 4th day of her working on the map, he stood in the doorway and looked at what she had done and said, simply, "He would have liked that," and she said she hoped so, and he nodded and left. She thought about what the map required of her, not skill. She had given it what skill she could manage, which was imperfect but genuine, not technical knowledge. She had the notebooks, which contained everything the map needed in terms of information. What it required, she understood as the days passed, was simply the willingness to sit here and do the work, to give the time that the work needed, to attend to each line as though it mattered, because it did matter, not in any large or important way, but in the way all careful small work matters, which was that it made something accurate and useful, where before there had been something incomplete, Her father had understood this. He had understood it about every map he had made. She was sitting at his desk with his instruments and his notebooks, understanding it now herself. The north field was finished by the end of the 8th day, and by the 10th, the last of the outlying fields had been cut and carted and stacked, and the harvest was over. She was aware of this in the way she had been aware of the harvest's progress throughout, as a presence and then as its absence, the farm's sounds changing on the day after the final field was done, the concentrated purposeful noise of the cutting giving way to the quieter activities of the post-harvest farm, the checking of stores and the maintenance of equipment, and the slower pace that followed any period of sustained intense effort. Mr. Ackroyd came to the map room on the morning of the 11th day and stood in the doorway and said, "Harvest done." And she said, "I know, I noticed." And he said, "Good year, better than last." And she said that was good, and he nodded and went. She had been in the map room every morning for the past 8 days, working on the map. The right section was more than half completed now. She could see the shape of the whole emerging, the blank space filling in the orderly way that a map fills in when the work proceeds consistently, the landscape revealing itself in the cartographic shorthand her father had used across 40 years, and that she had learned, imperfectly but adequately, in the past week. She had rendered the northern moor country as he had surveyed it, the contour lines closely spaced on the steep ground, opening out on the plateau sections, the drainage patterns marked in the standard notation, the footpaths and tracks recorded where they existed, the whole built up from the field notebooks into a rendering that was, if not equal to his best work, at least faithful to it and accurate in its information. She had reached, in the upper section of the right half, the area where the X had appeared on all the previous maps. She had been approaching this section for 2 days, the work moving steadily northward across the sheet, and had not been entirely sure what she would do when she got there. She sat for a long time with the map and the pen and the question. She could leave the section blank, not unfinished. The rest of the map was finished around it, but simply unmarked at the specific point. This would be accurate in one sense. Her father's mark was his, not hers, and she had no cartographic reason to place a mark there herself. She could reproduce the X exactly, put the same symbol in the same ink at the same position, a continuation of his practice. But this felt like something she was not entitled to do. The X belonging to a private language she had not invented and could not inherit simply by proximity. She thought about what the place was, a site, a location on the moor, a point that could be accurately identified by its coordinates, a ruined farmhouse, which was a kind of feature that cartographers did record, the ruins of abandoned settlements appearing on survey maps as a matter of geographical fact, the ruin itself being as real as the standing farmhouse had been. She dipped the pen and drew, in her father's notation for a ruined structure, a small open square, the standard symbol, at the precise position of the X. Beside it, in her neatest small hand, following the cartographic convention for named features, Pennington, ruin, she set the pen down and looked at what she had done. The ruin of Pennington, accurately marked, named, located on the northern moor, in the place where it actually was, a geographical fact. Her father had circled it with a private mark for 26 years. She had put it on the map as what it was. On the 12th morning she walked to Pennington again. She had not planned a second visit. The first had felt, in some sense, complete. The thing it had given her already received and absorbed into the understanding she had been building across the days in the map room. But she found, on the morning after she marked the ruin on the map, that she wanted to go back, not for any purpose she could articulate precisely, but with the simple sense that she was not finished with the place, or it was not finished with her, which was the same thing expressed differently. The morning was different from the first visit, clouded rather than clear, the August light diffuse and flat rather than the low-angled gold of the earlier day, the moor under this light showing different colors than she had seen before, the heather's purple more visible now, without the sun's direct competition, the whole high ground a different version of itself than the morning version she had seen on the first visit. She walked the same route, the wall track, the cairn, the turn left, the barely there path through the heather, and arrived at the ruin from the same direction, and stood at the entrance gap as she had stood before. The ruin was the same, of course. Ruins did not change between visits 12 days apart. But she looked at it differently, as she had looked at the maps differently after Mr. Ackroyd's account of Eleanor Pennington. The same walls, the same open sky above them, the same August vegetation proceeding according to its own requirements within the structure of the abandoned house, but seen now with the additional information she had gathered and the map she had completed and the specific act of putting the ruin's name in the space where her father's private mark had been. She went inside. She stood in the main room again, the largest space, the proportions she had thought about on the first visit, the window gap directing the diffuse morning light across the uneven floor. She stood there for a while and thought about nothing in particular, which was different from the first visit when she had been thinking a great many things in rapid succession. Today she was simply present in the space, in the way she had learnt from the map room, receiving rather than examining, allowing the place its own meaning rather than requiring it to answer her questions. She thought about her father standing here 2 years ago, quiet in the afternoon when he came home. She thought about what he had found, what the place had given him in the hour or however long he had spent here, and whether it was similar to what she was finding, or whether it had been, for him, something she could not fully imagine because his particular history with the place was not hers. She thought it was probably different. His coming here had been the conclusion of a 26-year approach, the arrival after the long journey towards something he had been circling. Hers was something simpler, the daughter of a man she had not fully known, standing in the place that had mattered to him, trying to understand him a little better by standing where he had stood. These were not the same thing, but they were not incompatible things either, and she was here, and the moor was around her, and the August day was proceeding with the patience of a landscape that does not require its visitors to understand it before permitting them to stand in it. She stood in the ruined house for perhaps 30 minutes. Then she walked back to Stonegate Farm and sat at the drawing board and picked up the pen and continued the map. On the 13th evening, Mr. Ackroyd sat with her. This was unusual. He had come to the map room every morning, had stood in the doorway and reported and occasionally said something about the map's progress, but had not sat. He came this evening after supper, which she had eaten alone as always, Mrs. Hartley serving and going, and appeared at the doorway and said, "If you don't mind, I'll sit for a bit." She said she didn't mind and found the second chair, a plain wooden one that had always been in the corner and that she had not yet sat on because the desk stool was sufficient for the work, and brought it beside the desk, and he sat with his hands on his knees in the way of a man who is accustomed to working with his hands and finds stillness somewhat foreign to them. They sat for a while without speaking, which was comfortable in the way that their silences had always been comfortable, earned through years of occasional proximity, the comfort of two people who do not require each other to perform. He said, after a time, "I've been in this room 100 times and never properly looked at the maps." She looked at the walls. They reward looking, she said. He turned to the nearest large map, the survey of the Central Dales, the one she thought of as his middle period work, the line at its most assured and the rendering at its most complete. He looked at it for a while. He was a remarkable man, Mr. Ackroyd said, in his particular way. Not a man you'd notice if you passed him in Caldwell Cross on a market day. But what he did? He stopped. She waited. He knew this ground, Mr. Ackroyd said, better than anyone. Not just the measurements. Farmers know the measurements. They live by the measurements. He knew the ground the way you know something you've spent a long time thinking about, as well as walking over. He used to say, "This was years ago. I remember it because it struck me as unusual." He used to say that the country was always there before the map, and the map was just your way of saying you'd been paying attention. She thought about this. The country is always there before the map. He was paying attention, she said. For 40 years, Mr. Ackroyd said. He looked at her with his direct grey eyes. So are you, now, in a different way. She looked at the map on the desk. The nearly complete right section, tomorrow's work, visible in the remaining blank space, which was now only a small section in the top right corner. "I'm doing what I can," she said. "It's what he would have done," Mr. Ackroyd said. "What he could, with what he had." He stood, with the careful economy of his movements. "I'll let you get on." He went to the door and then turned. "He would have liked having you here," he said. I think he never quite knew how to say so. He was better at the maps. She looked at the maps on the walls, 40 years of her father's best attention given to the ground he loved in the form he had found for loving it. "I know," she said. Mr. Ackroyd nodded once and left, his footsteps quiet down the corridor, the farm's evening settling around her. She finished the map on the 14th morning. The final section had been the small northwest corner, a piece of high moorland above the watershed, the most difficult terrain on the sheet because of the way the contours compressed in the steepest section, requiring the closest spacing she had attempted and the most careful control of the pen. She had left it for last deliberately, understanding that it was the technically most demanding section and that she would be better equipped to attempt it after 2 weeks of daily practice with the instruments than she had been at the beginning. She sat at the desk at 7 o'clock when the east light was at its best and worked through the morning without stopping, the compass dividers moving methodically across the field notebooks and then to the sheet, each measurement transferred with the care she had brought to every line of the past 2 weeks. The pen held its ink well. The lines came out with a consistency she found, comparing them to her father's finished sections, not equal but adequate, within the range of what the map needed to be functional and accurate. At 10:30 she drew the final contour line and set the pen down. She sat back and looked at the completed map. It was not his map exactly. She could see the places where her line differed from his, slightly heavier in some sections, slightly irregular in others, the places where her inexperience showed in the way all inexperience shows in the presence of accomplished work, as a variation from the standard rather than an achievement of it. But the information was complete and correct, drawn from his field notebooks, placed on the sheet in his notation, rendered with his instruments on his paper. Pennington was marked in the upper section, the small open square of the cartographic ruin symbol, the name beside it in the small neat hand she had developed across 2 weeks of daily mapping. Not an X, the ruin as a ruin, accurately located, accurately named. She sat at the desk for a long time after the pen was down. She thought about what her father had done in this room for 40 years and what she had done in it for 2 weeks, and understood that these were not equivalent things but that they were related things, the shorter contained within the longer, the way a tributary is contained within a river, not the same scale, but part of the same watershed. She thought about going back to London, which she would do in 3 days. The solicitor's matters were settled. The farm would continue under Mr. Ackroyd's management. There was no question of selling. She had never seriously considered it. The farm was part of the ground her father had surveyed, and it would remain in the family that had given his work its home. She would come back, more often than she had, because she understood now that the farm and the map room and the maps on the walls were not merely an inheritance, but a record, and that records benefited from being returned to. She picked up the pen once more and turned the sheet to the lower right corner, where her father had always placed his date notation. She wrote, in the style of his notation, the date, August 1875, and below this, in her own hand, smaller, completed by L. Vane, not his name, not hers alone, the continuation of something marked accurately in the place where such markings belonged. The days after finishing the map had a different quality from the days of working on it. She had not expected this, had not thought about what would happen when the task she had set herself was done, having been sufficiently occupied with the task itself to not look past its completion. She found, in the 2 days remaining before her return to London, that the map room still drew her, but differently. The pull, now less purposeful, and more simply the pull of a room she had spent 2 weeks in and had come to know well. She went there each morning and sat and looked at the maps, which she could now read more completely than she had been able to on the first day. She had learned enough in 2 weeks of working from the field notebooks and the instruments to understand what she was seeing in the finished maps on the walls, not as someone with her father's deep knowledge, but as someone who had been inside the process and understood its stages and requirements. She found things she had missed on the first pass, small decisions visible in the finished maps that she could now identify as decisions, places where he had chosen to emphasize one feature over another, where the drainage pattern notation was slightly more elaborate than strictly necessary, because the drainage mattered in a specific way to the practical use of that particular section of moorland, where a path had been given slightly more visibility than its actual usage might warrant, because it was a path he apparently considered important. These were the judgments of a cartographer who knew the ground personally, who had walked every line he had drawn and made the drawing from inside the experience of the walking rather than from the outside of pure technical reproduction. She could see this now in a way she had not been able to see it before, and it made the maps on the walls into something additional to what they had been, not just a record of the ground, but a record of how her father had understood the ground, the two things inseparable in the way that any account of a place is inseparable from the person who gave it. She went through his field notebooks in the bookcase on the second to last day, reading them not for the information she had already used, but for themselves. The daily entries of a man going out onto the moor with his instruments and coming back in the evening and recording what he had found. The entries were not personal in the way a diary might be personal. They recorded measurements, conditions, features, but she could read in them, with 2 weeks of additional understanding of who had made them, a quality of presence, the notation of someone who was not just measuring a landscape, but attending to it, giving it the same quality of sustained care that her father had given everything he worked on. She had not known him well enough while he was living. This was a fact she had been carrying since June, alongside the ordinary grief and which the 2 weeks at Stonegate Farm had not resolved. She was not under the illusion that understanding a person's work gave you a complete understanding of the person, that she had somehow caught up with a lifetime of inadequate attention through 2 weeks of maps and notebooks and a walk to a ruined farmhouse. But she had known him better at the end of these 2 weeks than she had known him at the beginning, and knowing better was not nothing. She wrote to the publishing house to say she would return on Friday, and sat in the map room in the August afternoon and let the remaining light do what August light in Yorkshire always did: take its time, give what it had generously, and then go. She spent the last evening in the map room. She had thought she might sit in the main room, the room where her father had spent his evenings, the one that was in some ways more his in daily use than the room where he had worked, but found, when supper was done and the farm was settling into its August night, that the map room was where she wanted to be. She had spent more time in it across these 2 weeks than her father had spent with her across the 2 or 3 days of any previous visit, and it had become, in that accumulation, a room she knew differently from the way she had known any room in this house before. She lit the lamp and sat at the desk and looked at the completed map. In lamplight, the map looked different from how it had looked in daylight: warmer, the lines softened by the amber of the lamp, the paper's cream tone deepened. Her father's lines and hers, which were distinct in daylight, were less distinct now, the lamp reducing the difference in a way the sun did not, the whole sheet reading as a more unified thing than it did in the clear morning light. She found this, somehow, exactly right. She looked at Pennington in the map's upper section, the small open square, the name beside it, a ruin, accurately located. The thing it was, given its proper notation. She thought about the journey that had produced this map, her father's 40 years of surveying the ground, her 2 weeks of attempting to complete what he had left unfinished, and behind all of that the complicated personal history that had given the northern moor its particular weight in his attention. She thought about Eleanor Pennington, who had gone to Canada in the 1850s and whose current circumstances she did not know and had no means of knowing, and about what her father had felt in the decades between Eleanor's departure and his own death, and whether the red X on 12 maps had been grief or something else, love in its long-term form perhaps, the form it takes when the object of it is no longer present and the feeling has nowhere to go but inward, where it becomes simply a part of the texture of a life. She thought about the walk to Pennington and the ruined walls and the fact of having stood there. She thought about "I meant to go," written in his careful hand at the end of the last map's finished section. He had meant to go. He had gone once, 2 years before he died, and the going had given him what it gave him, the not unhappily quiet that Mr. Ackroyd had described, the quality of someone who had finished something. She had meant to finish the map, and had finished it. These were not the same finishings, but she understood, sitting in the lamplight with the completed map before her, that the map had needed to be finished in the same way that the visit to Pennington had needed to be made, not because finishing resolved anything, not because going resolved anything, but because the unfinished and the unvisited had been sitting in the room and in the landscape, asking to be completed, and she had been the person here to do it. She turned the lamp down and went upstairs to bed, leaving the map room as her father had always left it, door closed, everything in its order, the completed map on the drawing board in the east light it would receive in the morning. She woke on her last morning at Stonegate Farm to a quieter yard than she had woken to on any previous morning of the visit. The harvest was done. The particular concentrated urgency of the harvest season, the early starts, the full days, the sense of everything being organized around a single pressing purpose, had given way to the ordinary rhythms of the farm's post-harvest life, and the yard sounds this morning were the ordinary sounds of a working farm going about its work without crisis, a cart being loaded, a gate closing, the horses, Mr. Ackroyd's voice giving some instruction that she could not quite make out, but which had his characteristic quality of quiet authority, delivered without excess. She dressed slowly, as someone not in a hurry to complete the preparations that would set the departure in motion. Her trunk was already mostly packed. She had been doing this in stages across the past few days, the gradual dismantling of the small arrangements a person makes when settling temporarily into a place. The things moved to accommodate the usual space of the room being returned to their original positions. She went downstairs and ate breakfast in the kitchen and talked with Mrs. Hartley, who had been at Stonegate Farm for 23 years and who had loved her father in the practical, uncomplicated way of someone who had cooked for him daily and understood his habits and preferences with the thorough knowledge of close proximity without personal intimacy. He liked the bread cut thick, Mrs. Hartley said, about nothing in particular standing at the stove, and he always had 2 cups of tea in the morning and then nothing until luncheon, no matter how long the morning was. Louisa thought about her father at breakfast, the thick bread, the 2 cups of tea, and found that these small specific details of his daily life, given to her now by the woman who had provided them for 23 years, had a particular weight that the larger facts of his character did not quite achieve. This was what you lost when a person died, she thought. Not only the person but the daily texture of their being in the world, the small habitual particulars of how they inhabited an ordinary day. She went to the map room after breakfast for the last time. The map was on the drawing board in the east light, exactly as she had left it the previous evening. She stood before the board and looked at the completed sheet, her father's work and hers together, his 40 years and her 2 weeks, the ground between Stonegate Farm and Pennington rendered in the notation he had used all his professional life. Pennington itself marked in the upper section with its proper cartographic symbol and its proper name. She thought about taking the map to London, considered it seriously, the map being part of the estate and therefore technically hers, the natural thing perhaps being to bring the completed work with her. She left it on the board. It belonged here. The map of the Northern Dales above Caldwell Cross, completed in August 1875 from Thomas Vane's field surveys, belonged in the room where it had been made, and where his other maps were kept, and where the east morning light fell across the drawing board at the same angle it had fallen for 40 years of mornings. She would come back and see it here. She would come back more often than she had before. She closed the map room door behind her, gently, and picked up her bag and walked out to the yard where the trap was waiting. Mr. Ackroyd walked with her to the trap. He did not say much. He rarely did, and she had long since stopped expecting or needing him to. But he walked beside her across the yard with the deliberateness of someone who has decided that presence is the appropriate form of attention and is offering it fully. At the trap he lifted her bag without being asked and secured it with the efficiency of someone who had done this particular task many times with many different travelers leaving Stonegate Farm over the years, and then stood back with his hands at his sides. "The farm should be in reasonable shape when you come back," he said. She looked at him. "When do you think that will be?" He considered. "Spring, perhaps. There are things that want looking at in spring." He paused. "And the map room will be here." She understood what he was saying, which was that the room and its contents and the work she had begun in it and not yet finished, because 2 weeks was the beginning of understanding her father's work, not the completion of it, would be there for her return, kept in the same order he had kept it, waiting with the patience of a room that had been waiting for things before and knew how. She thanked him, which he received with his customary slight nod, and got into the trap, and the driver turned the horse and they moved out of the yard and down the farm track toward the main road. She did not look back immediately. She let the farm track pass beneath the trap's wheels and watched the lane ahead, the stone walls on either side, the moor visible above them in the August morning light, clear today, the heathers purple now fully established, the high ground showing the specific color of itself in August that she had not seen for 12 years of being away in August, and that she found, seeing it now, to be one of those colors that the memory does not fully retain and must be seen again to be properly known. At the lane's end, where it met the main road, she looked back. Stonegate Farm was visible from here, the low grey house, the yard, the harvested fields spread golden around it, and above everything the moor, the heather, the particular quality of the northern Dales sky in August, which was a blue that had no blue quite like it in the south. The map room window was a small dark rectangle in the east face of the house, catching no reflection from this angle and this light, simply present, part of the building's face. She turned back to the road ahead. She thought about the map on the drawing board, the completed map, her father's field surveys rendered in his notation, Pennington marked in its correct place on the northern moor. She thought about the 12 maps on the walls with their small red X at the same position for 26 years, and the one completed map that had replaced the X with a ruined symbol and a name. She thought about Mr. Ackroyd saying he would have liked having you here. She thought about the instruments in the fitted case which she was leaving at the desk, and about the field notebooks in the bookcase which she was also leaving, and about the fact that there were sections of the Dales that her father had not yet mapped, sections further north, sections she had seen in the unfinished notes in the bottom drawer of the bookcase, preliminary surveys he had intended to develop into full maps and had not reached. She was a woman who worked with geographical texts. She had 2 weeks of practice with cartographic instruments. She would come back in spring. The trap reached Caldwell Cross and turned south toward Harrogate. She returned to London on a Friday afternoon in late August and found it, as she always found it after Yorkshire, too loud and too close and smelling of too many things at once, the particular quality of a city that had accumulated too many of its own purposes in too small a space and had forgotten that other arrangements were possible. She managed this. She always managed it. It was a thing that resolved itself within a few days as the familiarity of the city reasserted itself and the Yorkshire air became something she had been in rather than something she was in. She went back to the publishing house on Monday and found her desk as she had left it, and her manuscripts as she had left them, and her colleagues as they had always been, and resumed the work with the competence that had never been in doubt. But she found the work different, in a way she was not certain she could have articulated precisely. She had always been good at her work. She had understood the books she worked with, the geographical texts, the travel accounts, the occasional scientific survey that came through the publishing house's geography list, with the professional competence of someone who had been doing this work for several years and had developed, through repetition, a reliable sense of what was well done and what was not. She had known how to evaluate a map, how to assess whether a geographical account was accurate and whether the cartographic materials supporting it were adequate. She knew something additional now. She had stood at the drawing board and made the marks herself, had felt the resistance of the mapping paper and the way the ink behaved on it, and the particular quality of attention required to produce a consistent line across a large sheet. She had made something imperfectly and understood from the making what the making required. This changed how she read the work that came across her desk, not dramatically. She had not become a cartographer, could not evaluate the technical quality of a map with the authority of someone who had spent 40 years developing that authority. But she had been inside the process, and the having been inside changed the perspective on the outside in the way that all direct experience changes the perspective on related things encountered subsequently. She wrote to Mr. Ackroyd to say she had arrived safely and to ask about the farm's post-harvest condition. He replied with characteristic economy, "Farm in good order, Northfield resting, weather fine. The map room is as you left it." She put this letter in the drawer of her desk at the publishing house and thought about the map room, the map on the drawing board, the east window, the maps on the walls. She began, in the evenings after work, to read the cartographic reference text she had available, not the texts on her professional shelves, which she knew well, but the more technical works she had not previously had occasion to consult, the practical manuals of survey method and instrument use that she found in the British Museum reading room when she went there on 2 successive Saturday mornings. She was not training to be a cartographer, she was simply learning more. The distinction seemed to her important. She was not trying to become something she was not, but to better understand something that had been part of her inheritance all along, and that she had not, until August, engaged with fully. She read and made notes and thought about spring. In September, a manuscript arrived at the publishing house that she had been expecting. A geographical survey of the northern Pennines, written by a retired army surveyor, submitted for possible publication in the geography list. She had been the one to invite the submission the previous year, after reading a paper by the author in a geographical journal and finding it both accurate and unusually readable, the combination being rarer in geographical writing than it ought to be. The manuscript had been delayed. The author had needed more time to complete the northern sections and had arrived now, in early September, in a large envelope with the covering letter she had been told to expect. She opened the envelope at her desk and removed the manuscript and the accompanying maps and set them before her. The maps were good. She could see this immediately with the eye that had spent 2 weeks with her father's work and had then spent September evenings with the technical literature. The lines were consistent, the notation was standard and correctly applied, the rendering of the topography was accurate and clear. They were not her father's maps, different hand, different subject, different scale, but they were made with the same quality of care, the same respect for the accuracy of the ground they represented. She sat with the maps for longer than she needed to in order to assess them professionally. She sat with them because they were good, and because sitting with something good is its own justification, the pleasure of encountering careful work not requiring any additional purpose beyond the encounter itself. She wrote her assessment that afternoon, a positive recommendation with specific editorial notes, the detailed practical response of someone who knew the material and had taken it seriously, and went home in the early September evening and sat in her small London rooms and thought about the northern Pennines and about the northern Dales, which were adjacent territories though with distinct characters, and about the maps of each and what the differences between them revealed about the different ground. She wrote a long letter to the publishing house author in response to the manuscript, more detailed than her assessments usually were, because she had more to say than usual. She had sat with his maps as she had sat with her father's maps, and had found in them what she had found in her father's work, the record of someone's sustained attention to a specific landscape, the evidence of years of walking and measuring and thinking about what the ground required in order to be accurately represented. She mentioned in the letter that she had recently spent time with the work of an unpublished cartographer of the Northern Dales, and that she had found his surveys among the most accurate and most useful she had encountered. She did not say it was her father. She said simply that the work existed and was held privately, and that she believed it deserved wider attention. The publishing house author wrote back within the week, expressing interest. She put his letter in the drawer alongside Mr. Ackroyd's. She was beginning to understand what she might do next. October arrived, and Louisa found herself counting towards spring with a patience that was, she understood, the patience of someone who has something to return to. She had not spent much of her adult life with this specific kind of patience, the patience of anticipation rather than endurance, the patience of knowing that something good is coming rather than simply waiting for the current difficult thing to end. The 12 years in London had been largely the other kind, the endurance variety, the getting through until the next thing, the next position, the next manuscript, the next slight improvement. She had not been unhappy, but she had not, she understood now, been waiting for anything in particular. She was waiting for spring now. Spring at Stonegate Farm, the map room with its east light, the field notebooks in the bookcase, the sections of the Northern Dales that her father had begun and not completed. She continued her Saturday mornings at the British Museum reading room, working through the cartographic literature with the methodical attention she brought to any subject she had decided to properly understand. She was not becoming an expert. She was clear-eyed about this. She was 30 years old and had 2 weeks of practical experience and whatever she could acquire from books, which was not nothing, but was also not expertise. But she was building something, layering the technical knowledge onto the practical experience and the practical experience onto the emotional history, and finding that the building itself was satisfying in a way she had not expected. She received a second letter from the publishing house author in October, asking about the unpublished work she had mentioned. She wrote back, describing the surveys more fully, the coverage, the scope, the quality of the rendering, the field notebooks that provided the data for survey work not yet transferred to finished sheets. She did not yet say she was the daughter of the man who had made them. She described the work on its merits, because the work merited description on its merits. The author wrote back with a proposal, a collaboration, he suggested, between his published survey of the Northern Pennines and the unpublished survey of the Northern Dales, a combined work of the two adjacent territories that would constitute the most complete cartographic coverage of the region currently available. He was interested in discussing the terms. She read this letter at her desk in the publishing house, and then read it again, and then sat for a long time, looking at the wall above her desk, which had a map of England pinned to it. A standard commercial map, nothing like her father's work, and thought about what her father would have made of this proposal. She thought he would have been characteristically quiet about it. He had not sought recognition for his work, had sent occasional surveys to geographical societies, but had not published, had not sought the wider audience that his quality might have warranted. This had been a choice, she understood now, made on its own terms, the work done for the doing rather than for what the doing produced. But she was not him, and his work deserved to be seen. She wrote to Mr. Ackroyd asking him to confirm that the notebooks and the finished surveys were in good order and secure. He replied with his characteristic economy that everything in the map room was exactly as it had been left, and that he would ensure it remained so. She wrote to the publishing house author to say she was interested in discussing the proposal, and that she would be in Yorkshire in spring and could arrange a meeting there. She put the letter in the post on a Friday morning in October, walking through London in the early autumn, and felt, posting it, that something her father had left unfinished was beginning, slowly and by an entirely unexpected route, to move toward its proper continuation. November and December passed in the way of London winters, the light gone early, the city closing in on itself, the particular quality of a large urban place in winter that was both its most characteristic and its most difficult, the streets wet and dark, and the air carrying the cold of a climate that did not have the grace of real snow to justify it. Louisa worked. She had always worked through winters, had found in work, across 12 years in the city, the most reliable form of the stability that winter required, the manuscripts and the maps providing a structure that the season itself did not. She worked now with the same reliability, but with a different quality of attention, the Saturday mornings at the British Museum continuing, the correspondence with the publishing house author developing into a genuine professional exchange, the planning for spring quietly accumulating in the notebook she had begun keeping for the purpose. She had told the publishing house author in a letter in November that the surveys had been made by her father. She had not been certain whether to say so, had considered whether the information was relevant to the professional discussion, whether it complicated things in ways she did not need to complicate. But she had found, drafting the letter, that it was simply true, and that the conversation she was having was honest enough to warrant it. The author had replied with the particular warmth of a man who understood what it meant to inherit a body of work and feel responsible for its continuation. He had said that family surveying traditions were among the most valuable in the history of British cartography, and that he would be honoured to have his own work considered alongside that of Thomas Vane, whose name he appeared already to know from the Geographical Society records. She had not known her father had submitted to the Geographical Society. She wrote to Mr. Ackroyd and asked, and Mr. Ackroyd wrote back that yes, over the years he had sent surveys to various societies and received acknowledgements, and that the correspondence was in the bottom drawer of the desk in the map room, which she had found and not read. She thought about going to the map room in winter, reading the correspondence. She thought about it and found she was not ready, that the reading she needed to do there was reading she wanted to do in the east morning light of the room's own particular season, which was not a London winter evening, but the specific quality of light that belonged to the room as she now knew it. She waited for spring. She wrote letters and read technical texts and worked through her regular publishing house manuscripts and thought about the northern Dales in February, the moor under snow if there was snow, the fields empty, the map room the same east-facing room in February light as in August light, and found the thinking satisfying in the particular way of anticipation that knows what it is anticipating. She was going back in March. She had arranged the leave from the publishing house and had written to Mr. Ackroyd and had written to the publishing house author who would come to Stonegate Farm in the third week of March to look at the surveys. She had looked at her father's field notebooks, the ones she had brought back from August, and had identified the sections that remained to be mapped, and had begun, in the evenings, making preliminary sketches of how those sections might proceed. She was not her father. She would never be her father, but she was the person who had sat at his desk for 2 weeks and completed his last map, and who had the notebooks and the instruments and the capacity for sustained attention, and these things were, she had come to understand, what the work required. A letter from Mr. Ackroyd arrived in February, which was unusual. He wrote when she wrote to him, responding rather than initiating, so a letter from him unprompted was notable in a way that a letter from almost anyone else would not have been. She opened it at her desk in the publishing house on a grey February morning, the London sky outside the window, The particular flat grey of winter that was neither raining nor doing anything else, simply being grey with the patience of a sky that had no particular need to be otherwise. He had written in his characteristic economy of style, the sentence is short and the information given in the order it was needed, rather than any other order. Miss Vane, I thought you should know that the map room is in good order as you left it. In going through the room this past month to ensure everything was properly maintained through the winter, I found something I thought you should be aware of. In the back of the second shelf of the bookcase, behind the volumes, there are 2 rolls of survey sheets, completed maps I had not seen before. They appear to be surveys of sections north of Pennington, beyond the area your father usually mapped. I have not unrolled them fully, as they seem delicate, but I could see from the exposed portion that they are drawn in the same hand as the other maps and appear to be of similar quality. I thought you should know these were there before your visit in March, Mr. Ackroyd. She read this letter 3 times. Surveys north of Pennington, beyond the area her father usually mapped. She had thought, across the months since August, that the northern sections were the field notebooks, the preliminary surveys not yet transferred to finished sheets, the work she and the publishing house author had discussed as the potential scope of a continuation project. She had not thought there were completed sheets she had not found. She wrote back to Mr. Ackroyd the same afternoon. Please leave them as they are. I will look at them in March. She sat at her desk for a long while after sending this letter, thinking about what it might mean. 2 rolls of survey sheets, completed, in the back of the bookcase behind the volumes, found by Mr. Ackroyd going through the room on a winter maintenance check. Her father had made more maps than she had found on the walls. Maps he had stored rather than displayed. Maps of the ground north of Pennington, north of the point he had marked with a red X for 26 years, north of the ruin, north of everything she had identified in August as the edge of his working territory. He had gone further north than she had known. He had mapped ground he had not put on the walls. She thought about the annotation on the 1861 map. The ground between here and Pennington has never been properly surveyed. I know it better than the map shows. This is a deficiency I intend to correct. He had intended to correct it. She had found the correction of the ground up to Pennington in the unfinished map. But beyond Pennington, north of the ruin, further on to the high moor, there were completed sheets. He had surveyed ground he had apparently also known better than the displayed maps showed. She sat with this through the February afternoon and thought about her father going north, beyond the point he had marked and returned to for 26 years, and mapping what he found there. March could not come quickly enough. She arrived at Stonegate Farm on the 1st of March, earlier in the year than she had ever visited, and found the farm in its late winter state, the fields empty and grey-brown, the walls dark with rain, the moor above the farm holding the particular quality of early spring that was not yet spring, but was no longer quite winter, the heather still brown, the first suggestion of new growth barely visible in the sheltered places. Mr. Ackroyd met her in the yard as he had always met her, without demonstration, with a quality of presence that was more reliable than any demonstration could have been, and said, "The rolls are on the desk in the map room. I thought you'd want them there." She went directly to the map room. The room was as she had left it in August. Map on the board, instruments in their case, notebooks in the bookcase, the larger maps on the walls. The east window showed the farm's early March morning, the light thin and clear and very different from the August light she had worked in, a different quality entirely, more austere, more honest about what it was. On the desk, beside the completed map, 2 rolls of survey sheet tied with the same thin cording her father used for stored work. She untied the first roll carefully and spread it on the desk beside the completed map, weighting the corners with the brass weights she found in the instrument case. It was a map of the ground north of Pennington, the high moor above the ruin, the territory she had seen on her second visit as a landscape of heather and long sight lines, and the particular austere beauty of the high ground in August. Her father had mapped it with the same care he had given to everything, the same consistent line, the same notation, the same patient rendering of the terrain. The footpath that led from Pennington northward was marked with unusual care, more detail than a path that seemed rarely used would typically receive. She spread the second roll. It covered the territory further north still, the highest ground, the watershed, the view she could only imagine from the maps because she had not walked there. It was finished, completed, signed in the lower right with his notation and a date, October 1873, 2 years before he died, the year before the walk Mr. Ackroyd had described, the autumn morning, the quiet return, the quality of someone who had finished something. She looked at the 2 rolls spread on the desk and understood that he had not walked to Pennington for the first time on that morning 2 years before his death. He had been mapping the territory north of it for at least 2 years before that, had completed these surveys in October 1873, had then walked to Pennington in the autumn of the following year, not for the first time, having already mapped the ground all around it, but for a different kind of first time, the first time as a going to rather than a mapping through. He had known the ground, he had mapped it carefully, and then, finally, he had simply walked to it, directly, not as a surveyor but as a man. She stood at the desk with the 3 maps, the completed August map and the 2 rolls, and understood her father better than she had understood him at any previous point in the month since August. He had not been circling something he could not reach. He had been approaching it in the only way he knew how to approach anything, which was slowly and carefully and with full attention, mapping the ground as he went. She walked north of Pennington on the morning of the second day. She had intended to wait, to spend the first days in the map room with the newly found maps and the field notebooks, to understand the terrain on paper before walking it as her father had always understood terrain before walking it. But she woke on the second morning to a clear March day with the particular quality of the first genuinely clear day of the year, the air bright and cold and the light already carrying the increased angle of the turn toward spring, and found that the walk could not wait. She took the route she knew, the wall track, the cairn, the turn north, the path through the heather to the ruin, and stopped at Pennington long enough to stand in the entrance gap and look at the familiar interior of the ruined house with the March light across it, different again from the August light of her previous visits, cleaner, more austere, the moor around it showing the first faint green at the base of the heather stems. Then she walked north. The path was clearer than she expected, more worn than the path to the ruin, which surprised her, because the territory north of Pennington was uninhabited and, as far as she knew, rarely visited. But the path continued, through the heather and across the slight rise and onto the high plateau of the northern moor, and it was a real path, the kind made by repeated passage rather than occasional walking. She understood, as she walked it, that this was the path her father had walked, not just once, not just in 1873 during the survey work, but repeatedly over years. The path was too established for occasional use. He had come here more often than she had known, more often than the single documented visit Mr. Ackroyd had described. The high ground was extraordinary in March. She had no other word for it. The moor stretched in every direction to horizons that were further than the eye could naturally reach. The the sky above enormous and clear, the light falling on the heather and the grass and the distant walls of the lower farms with an evenness that showed everything in its actual proportion rather than in the emphasis that lower angle light imposed. It was a landscape without anywhere to hide. She walked for half an hour north of Pennington before she stopped. She stopped because she had reached the point she recognized from the maps, the high watershed, the place where the land divided between the drainage south toward Caldwell Cross and north toward Coldmoor, the exact point that her father had rendered with such care in the October 1873 survey. She stood at the watershed and turned in every direction and saw what he had seen when he had stood here to take his measurements, the full extent of the northern dales in every direction, the ground she had been learning to read in its cartographic form spread before her in its actual form. She stood there for a long time. She thought about her father standing in this same place, compass in hand, noting the bearings and the heights and the drainage patterns with the careful accuracy that had produced the maps now in the map room. She thought about him coming back here, not with his instruments, but simply to stand, as she was standing, in the place he had paid the most sustained attention to across the longest portion of his working life. She thought about what it meant to know a place this well, not the knowledge of familiarity, but the knowledge of sustained, specific attention, the knowledge that comes from measuring and recording and returning and measuring again until the ground itself becomes a kind of second language, as readable as text. She walked back to Stonegate Farm in the March afternoon, carrying the specific knowledge of the watershed, and went to the map room and sat at the desk with the maps and the notebooks and began to plan the spring's work. And that is where we leave Louisa Vane tonight. In the map room at Stonegate Farm, in the early spring of 1876, in the particular quality of a March evening when the day's clear light has finally gone and the room holds the lamp's amber circle around the desk and the maps and the instruments and the person sitting among them. The completed map is on the drawing board, Thomas Vane's final survey, finished in August by the only person who had both the will and the proximity to finish it. Pennington marked in its proper place with its proper notation, the red X replaced by the cartographic truth of what the place actually was, which was a ruin on the northern moor, named and located and given its rightful position on the ground that contained it. On the desk beside the completed map, unrolled and weighted at the corners, the two surveys of the ground north of Pennington, October 1873, the high moor, the watershed, the path that is more worn than occasional use would produce. These have been here all winter, in the back of the bookcase behind the other volumes, waiting for the visit that would find them. They have been found. The field notebooks are open beside the surveys, the entries for the unmapped sections written in Thomas Vane's careful notation, the measurements and observations and preliminary sketches that will, in the weeks to come, become maps of their own, the next maps in a sequence that has not ended simply because the man who began it is gone. The publishing house author arrives in 3 weeks. He will look at the surveys and the notebooks and the maps on the walls, and he will understand, as Louisa now understands, that what exists here is not an uncompleted body of work, but a body of work in continuation. The continuation being slower now, more tentative, in different hands, but proceeding because the ground is still there, and the notebooks recorded accurately, and the instruments are still in their case, and the person sitting at the desk intends to use them. Sleep now. The map room will keep through the night, as it has always kept, the maps on the walls undisturbed, the instruments in their case, the surveys on the desk weighted at the corners, the lamp burning down to its last amber until morning, when it will be trimmed and relit for another day's work. Outside the east window, the farm's March night is very still, the moor above the fields dark and enormous and entirely itself, the path to Pennington and the path beyond Pennington present in the darkness, even though they cannot be seen, the ground holding all its information patiently, waiting to be mapped. The completed map is on the board, the new notebooks are open, the instruments are in their case. The country was always there before the map. The map is simply your way of saying you have been paying attention. Rest well.